The battlefield at Sekigahara was a nightmare of mud and blood. On October 21st, 1600, two massive armies clashed in the fog, fighting for the soul of Japan. In the heart of this chaos, a young warrior named Yagyu Munenori moved with a strange and deadly calm. While men screamed and died around him, his swordwork was precise, almost like a dance. He fought for Tokugawa Ieyasu, a powerful lord who dreamed of ruling a unified nation. Munenori's focus was absolute, but he was not just a fighter. Even here, on this bloody field, he was watching, learning the politics of power that would define his life. This single day would decide Japan's future and set the stage for one of history's most unusual advisors, a man who would master the art of ruling not just with a sword, but with his mind. Munenori was born in 1571 into the Yagyu clan, a family famous for its sword-fighting school. Their home was in the countryside near Kyoto, the old capital. From his earliest days, the way of the sword was his entire world. His teacher was his own father, Yagyu Munenori, a legendary swordsman. Muneyoshi had created a new style of fighting called Yagyu Shinkage-ryu. This wasn't just about killing. Muneyoshi taught a deeper idea, the life-giving sword. The goal was not to destroy your enemy, but to control the situation so completely that you never had to draw your blade at all. It was a philosophy of winning without fighting. For Munenori, training was brutal and constant. He learned that a true master could sense an opponent's intention before they even moved. This training shaped more than his body. It shaped how he saw the world. He learned to read people, to understand their fears and ambitions. This skill would become far more valuable than any cutting technique. A crucial moment came when Munenori was still a teenager. The powerful Lord Tokugawa Ieyasu was traveling through the region and decided to visit the Yagyu school. He wanted to see this famous sword style for himself. Muneyoshi, then an old man, did not fight. Instead, he sent his son, Munenori. The young warrior demonstrated his skill with such grace and control that Ieyasu was deeply impressed. It was more than a show of swordplay. It was a display of discipline and intelligence. Ieyasu saw something special in the young man. He gave Munenori a formal title on the spot, tying the Yagyu family to his own rising fortune. This meeting changed everything for Munenori. He was no longer just a rural swordmaster. He was now connected to one of the most powerful men in Japan, a man who was about to plunge the nation into its final decisive war. The lessons of the life-giving sword would soon be tested on a scale his father could never have imagined. The quiet world of the training hall was over. The great game of power was about to begin. The battle that would unify Japan came down to a single day. By the fall of 1600, the country was split between two massive coalitions. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient strategist who had waited decades for his moment. On the other was Ishida Mitsunari, a brilliant administrator who commanded the loyalty of powerful Western lords. The prize was total control of Japan. The cost would be measured in thousands of lives. Sekigahara was chosen almost by accident, a valley where the two armies happened to collide. Fog covered the field that morning, thick enough to hide entire regiments. Over 160,000 warriors gathered on that narrow plain, the largest battle Japan had ever seen. The tension was unbearable. Everyone knew this fight would end the decades of civil war, one way or another. Munenori fought in the thick of it, leading a small unit of Yagyu swordsmen. Around him, the battle was pure chaos. Arquebuses cracked through the fog. Cavalry charges broke infantry lines. Men slipped in the mud and were trampled by their own allies. But Munenori's training held. His movements were economical, efficient. Every strike had a purpose. He was not there to rack up kills. His job was to protect key commanders and watch for threats. Even in the madness, he was thinking several steps ahead. The turning point came around noon. A powerful lord named Kobayakawa Hideaki had been sitting on a hillside with 15,000 troops, watching the battle unfold. Both sides had tried to win his loyalty. Ieyasu had made promises. Mitsunari had made threats. For hours, Kobayakawa did nothing. Then suddenly, his forces charged down the hill, straight into Mitsunari's flank. The Western coalition shattered. What had been a close fight became a rout. By nightfall, Ishida Mitsunari was a fugitive and Tokugawa Ieyasu was the undisputed master of Japan. The aftermath was brutal. Thousands of heads were taken as trophies. Enemy lords were hunted down and executed. Mitsunari himself was captured within days and paraded through Kyoto before his beheading. Ieyasu showed no mercy to those who had opposed him, but for those who had fought at his side, the rewards were immense. Munenori's loyalty at Sekigahara earned him land, titles, and something far more valuable: access to the inner circle of the new regime. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor formally granted Ieyasu the title of shogun. The Tokugawa family now ruled Japan. The Edo period had begun, named for Ieyasu's new capital in the east. The age of open warfare was over, but a new kind of conflict was just starting: a shadow war of politics, loyalty, and information. The samurai who had spent their lives fighting on battlefields now had to learn a different kind of battle, and Munenori, with his unique blend of martial skill and strategic thinking, was perfectly positioned for this new world. In 1606, Munenori received an official appointment that would define the rest of his life. Tokugawa Hidetada, Ieyasu's son and the second shogun, named him the official kendo instructor to the Tokugawa family. On the surface, this seemed like a simple honor for a skilled swordsman. In reality, it was one of the most powerful positions in Japan. The swordmaster to the shogun was not just a teacher. He was a trusted advisor who spent hours each day in private with the most powerful man in the country. Daily life inside Edo Castle became Munenori's new battlefield. Every morning, he would arrive at the shogun's private training hall. These sessions were not public spectacles. Only a handful of trusted retainers were allowed to watch. Hidetada was a serious student, and Munenori pushed him hard. But the lessons went far beyond sword techniques. As they practiced, Munenori would talk about strategy, about reading an opponent's intentions, about the importance of controlling your own mind before you could control a situation. The shogun listened carefully. These were not abstract ideas. They were tools for ruling a fractious nation of proud warriors. Trust between them grew quickly. Hidetada began consulting Munenori on matters that had nothing to do with swordsmanship. A dispute between two powerful families, a suspicious letter from a distant province, rumors of a conspiracy. Munenori had a talent for cutting through the noise and seeing the real problem. His advice was always practical, never idealistic. He understood that ruling Japan meant managing egos, settling grudges, and occasionally making examples of people who stepped out of line. The position gave Munenori access to information that few others possessed. He sat in on meetings with senior advisors. He read intelligence reports from across the country. He knew which lords were loyal, which were resentful, and which were quietly building up their forces. This knowledge became his greatest weapon. A well-placed word to the shogun could destroy a rival or elevate an ally. Munenori never raised his voice, never made grand speeches. He simply offered observations, suggestions. But those quiet words carried immense weight. From this powerful base, Munenori began building his own network. He placed students in key positions throughout the government. He cultivated relationships with other advisors, learning their strengths and weaknesses. He made himself indispensable, not through force, but through competence and loyalty. The shogun came to rely on him for more than sword training. Munenori became a fixer, someone who could handle delicate problems quietly and efficiently. His reputation grew. People began to understand that crossing Yagyu Munenori meant crossing the shogun himself. The life-giving sword philosophy was no longer just about combat. It had become a way of wielding political power without ever drawing a blade. Peace was harder to maintain than war. After Sekigahara, Japan was technically unified under Tokugawa rule. But the country was still filled with samurai who had spent their entire lives fighting. These men had no useful skills beyond combat. Their lords had lost power and land. Resentment simmered everywhere. For the shogunate, the challenge was not defeating enemies on a battlefield. The challenge was identifying threats before they could organize and strike. Munenori understood this problem better than most. The old ways of warfare were obsolete. armies clashing in open fields. That era was finished. The new threats would come from the shadows, secret meetings in remote temples, coded letters between disgruntled lords, whispered conspiracies in sack houses. Winning this kind of conflict required a different set of tools. It required information. His role began to shift. The shogun still valued his sword training, but increasingly Hidetada turned to Munenori for intelligence work. A report would arrive about suspicious activity in a distant province. Munenori would dispatch one of his students to investigate. These students were not just swordsmen. They were observers, trained to notice details, to listen carefully, to ask the right questions without arousing suspicion. They became the shogun's eyes and ears across Japan. The first major test came in 1614, when rumors reached Edo of a conspiracy involving several Christian daimyo in Kyushu. Christianity had spread rapidly in southern Japan, and some lords had converted. The shogunate saw this as a potential threat. Foreign religion meant foreign loyalty. Munenori was tasked with finding out if the rumors were real. He sent agents to infiltrate Christian communities, to attend secret masses, to befriend converts and learn their plans. Within months, he had a complete picture. There was no organized rebellion, but there were dangerous connections to European powers. The information allowed the shogun to act decisively, banning Christianity and expelling foreign missionaries before any real conspiracy could form. This became Munenori's pattern. He built a network of informants that stretched across the entire country. Some were samurai, loyal to the Yagyu school. Others were merchants, monks, even criminals. Anyone who could provide useful intelligence. The system was informal but effective. Information flowed back to Edo constantly. A lord was gathering weapons. A ronin was making inflammatory speeches. A merchant was smuggling goods in violation of shogunate policy. Munenori reviewed these reports personally, deciding which required action and which were harmless. His methods were subtle. Unlike a traditional military commander, he rarely recommended direct confrontation. Instead, he would suggest quiet interventions. A troublesome lord might receive a surprise inspection of his domain. A suspicious monk might find himself transferred to a remote monastery. The message was clear. The shogunate was watching, always. This constant surveillance created a climate of caution. Potential rebels knew that any conspiracy would likely be discovered before it could succeed. The fear of being caught became its own form of control. Munenori's reputation grew darker during these years. People began calling him the shogun's shadow, a man who moved unseen but was always present. Stories spread about his network of spies, about his ability to uncover secrets. Some of these stories were exaggerated, but Munenori did nothing to correct them. Fear was useful. If people believed he knew everything, they would be less likely to plot against the shogunate. The life-giving sword philosophy had found its perfect application, winning without fighting, controlling through perception rather than violence. The philosophy Munenori had learned from his father was about to be tested in the real world of politics. The life-giving sword meant resolving conflicts without bloodshed, using psychology and strategy instead of steel. For years, this had been an abstract concept, something discussed in training halls. Now it became Munenori's primary weapon. The Oshikawa incident showed how this worked in practice. A minor lord named Oshikawa had been spreading rumors about corruption in the shogun's court. The accusations were vague but persistent. Traditional advisors recommended arresting Oshikawa and making an example of him. Munenori suggested a different approach. He arranged for Oshikawa to receive an unexpected honor, an invitation to a private tea ceremony with senior officials. At the ceremony, Munenori engaged Oshikawa in friendly conversation, never mentioning the rumors. Instead, he asked about Oshikawa's family, his domain, his concerns. Oshikawa, expecting confrontation, was disarmed by the courtesy. By the end of the evening, he understood the implicit message. The shogunate was aware of his activities, powerful enough to destroy him, but chose not to. The rumors stopped immediately. Oshikawa became one of the shogunate's most loyal supporters. This became Munenori's signature move. When faced with a problem, he looked for ways to neutralize it without creating martyrs or escalating conflicts. A ronin causing trouble in a town. Offer him employment in a remote garrison. a merchant evading taxes, a quiet conversation about the benefits of cooperation, a lord building unauthorized fortifications, a friendly reminder about the consequences of misunderstandings delivered over sake. The approach required patience and precise judgment. Munenori had to understand what each person valued, what they feared, what would motivate them to change their behavior. He studied people the way a swordsman studies an opponent's stance. Every interaction was a form of combat, but one where the goal was control, not destruction. Drawing your sword meant you had already failed. The true master never needed to fight at all. This philosophy extended to how he managed his own position. Munenori cultivated an image of quiet competence. He never sought public glory or formal titles beyond what he already held. Other advisors competed for the shogun's favor through grand gestures and elaborate displays of loyalty. Munenori simply did his job, solved problems, and stayed in the background. This made him less threatening to rivals and more trusted by the shogun. He understood that real power did not require public recognition. In fact, public recognition often made you a target. The greatest challenge to Tokugawa rule came in 1637, nearly 40 years after Sekigahara. A massive peasant uprising exploded in the Shimabara Peninsula, south of Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of farmers, many of them Christian converts, rose up against brutal taxation and religious persecution. They were led by a charismatic teenager named Amakusa Shiro, who claimed to perform miracles. The rebels seized an old castle and fortified it. Within weeks, they had defeated several samurai armies sent to crush them. The shogunate was facing its worst crisis since taking power. Munenori was now in his 60s, far too old for battlefield command. But his role in this conflict would prove more important than any general's. The shogun appointed him as a strategic coordinator, responsible for managing the flow of information and ensuring the various military forces worked together. The first challenge was understanding what was actually happening. Initial reports from the region were chaotic and contradictory. Some claimed the rebellion had 100,000 fighters. Others said it was a foreign invasion backed by the Portuguese. Munenori dispatched his most trusted agents to the area with clear instructions. Get accurate numbers, identify the real leaders, find out what the rebels actually wanted. Within 2 weeks, he had a clear picture. The rebellion was large, perhaps 30,000 people, but most were desperate farmers, not trained warriors. They were well fortified, but running low on supplies. There was no foreign support. This was a local uprising, driven by genuine grievances, but doomed to fail if handled correctly. Armed with this intelligence, Munenori advised a strategy of containment rather than immediate assault. Let the rebels exhaust their food supplies, cut off any possible reinforcements, use the time to gather overwhelming force. The shogunate assembled an army of over 125,000 troops, the largest military operation of the Edo period. Munenori coordinated the logistics, ensuring that different daimyo armies didn't clash with each other and that supply lines remained secure. His intelligence network identified potential sympathizers in nearby domains and neutralized them before they could act. The siege lasted 4 months. When the final assault came in April 1638, the outcome was never in doubt. The castle fell in a single day. The shogunate showed no mercy. Nearly every rebel was killed, including women and children. Amakusa Shiro's head was displayed in Nagasaki as a warning. The brutality was deliberate policy, designed to ensure no one would ever attempt such a rebellion again. For Munenori, Shimabara proved the value of his methods. Good intelligence had prevented the crisis from spreading. Careful coordination had avoided the kind of military disasters that had plagued earlier campaigns. The rebellion was crushed not just through force, but through superior information and planning. It was the life-giving sword applied to warfare itself, winning decisively by controlling every aspect of the conflict before the fighting even began. As Munenori entered his 70s, he turned his attention to a different kind of legacy. He had spent decades applying his father's teachings to the world of politics and power. Now he wanted to record those lessons for future generations. The result was Heiho Kadensho, often translated as the life-giving sword. It would become one of the most important texts in Japanese martial philosophy. Writing the book took years. Munenori was not a natural scholar. His strength had always been practical application, not abstract theory. But he understood that his methods needed to be preserved and taught systematically. The shogunate would need skilled advisors long after he was gone. His sons and students would need a guide to the kind of strategic thinking that had made him indispensable. The book was structured around sword-fighting techniques, but that was just the surface. Each combat principle was really a lesson about politics, leadership, and survival in a complex world. When Munenori wrote about reading your opponent's intention, he was teaching how to analyze a rival's true motivations. When he discussed controlling the center, he meant dominating the political space before conflicts could develop. The sword techniques were metaphors for a much larger game. One central concept was muto, fighting without a sword. Munenori argued that the highest level of mastery meant winning without violence. A true expert could disarm an opponent through positioning, timing, and psychological pressure alone. In political terms, this meant resolving conflicts through intelligence and manipulation rather than force. The goal was to make your enemy surrender before they even realized they were fighting. Another key idea was heijoshin, maintaining a calm mind in chaos. Munenori had learned this on the battlefield at Sekigahara and applied it throughout his career. Panic led to mistakes. Emotion clouded judgment. The advisor who could stay clear-headed during a crisis would always have an advantage. This wasn't about being cold or unfeeling. It was about discipline, about training yourself to think clearly when everyone around you was losing control. The book also contained practical advice about governance, how to identify reliable subordinates, how to detect lies and deception, how to balance severity and mercy when dealing with threats. These sections read less like philosophy and more like a manual for political survival. Munenori was writing for the shogun's future advisors, men who would need to navigate the same dangerous waters he had mastered. Heiho Kadensho was never published widely during Munenori's lifetime. It circulated only among senior Tokugawa officials and members of the Yagyu school. This was intentional. The knowledge was too valuable, too dangerous to share with potential enemies. But within that small circle, the book became essential reading. It codified Munenori's methods and ensured they would outlive him. The life-giving sword would continue to shape how the shogunate operated for generations to come. The inner court of the shogunate was a dangerous place, even for someone as skilled as Munenori. By the 1640s, he had served 3 shoguns across 4 decades. His influence was enormous, but that influence made him a target. Other advisors resented his access to power. Rival families saw the Yagyu clan as an obstacle to their own ambitions. Every day required careful navigation through a maze of competing interests and hidden agendas. The transition to the 3rd shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu, brought new challenges. Iemitsu was younger and more aggressive than his father. He wanted to prove himself, to put his own stamp on the government. This meant shaking up the old guard, replacing his father's advisors with his own people. Many officials who had served for decades suddenly found themselves pushed aside. Munenori watched these purges carefully, knowing he could easily be next. His survival strategy was the same one he had always used: make himself too valuable to remove. Iemitsu needed intelligence networks, and Munenori controlled the best system in Japan. The new shogun needed someone who understood the delicate balance of power among the daimyo, and Munenori had spent decades studying those relationships. Most importantly, Iemitsu needed someone he could trust completely. Someone with no personal ambitions beyond serving the Tokugawa family. Munenori cultivated that image carefully, but trust was never absolute in this world. A senior advisor named Hotta Masamori began spreading rumors that Munenori was too old, that his methods were outdated, that younger men should take over intelligence operations. Hotta wanted control of the spy network for himself. The campaign was subtle but persistent. Other officials began questioning Munenori's recommendations, second-guessing his analysis. For the first time in decades, his position felt uncertain. Munenori's response showed everything he had learned about political combat. He did not confront Hotta directly or defend himself publicly. Instead, he quietly arranged for Hotta to receive a sensitive intelligence assignment, investigating corruption in a distant province. The assignment seemed like an honor, a chance for Hotta to prove his capabilities. In reality, it was a trap. The province Munenori chose was a political minefield, filled with competing factions and unclear loyalties. Hotta stumbled badly, making enemies and producing contradictory reports. Within 6 months, his reputation was damaged beyond repair. He was reassigned to a ceremonial position with no real power. Munenori never said a word about the incident. He simply continued his work as if nothing had happened. The episode reinforced an important lesson. In the inner court, direct confrontation was almost always a mistake. The goal was to maneuver your rivals into destroying themselves. Let them overreach. Let them make mistakes. Stay patient, stay quiet, and wait for the right moment. The life-giving sword meant never having to strike the killing blow yourself. During these years, Munenori also focused on securing his family's future. His son, Yagyu Mitsuyoshi, had been training since childhood to continue the family tradition. Munenori brought him into the inner court, introduced him to key officials, taught him the subtle arts of political survival. Mitsuyoshi was talented but impulsive, quick to anger when insulted. His father worked to temper that impulse, to teach him that patience was more powerful than pride. The lessons were hard-won. Mitsuyoshi made mistakes, offended important people, created problems his father had to quietly fix. But slowly he learned. By the mid-1640s, he was ready to take over when the time came. Munenori understood that his era was ending. The world he had helped create, the Tokugawa peace, the shadow war of intelligence and control, was now firmly established. The systems he had built would continue without him. His students held key positions throughout the government. His methods were codified in Heiho Kadensho. The Yagyu school would remain the shogun's swordmasters for generations. He had accomplished what few men in his position ever managed. He had made himself obsolete by making his work permanent. Yagyu Munenori died on May 11, 1646, at the age of 75. For a man who had lived through so much violence, the end came peacefully. He passed away in his residence in Edo, surrounded by family. There were no dramatic final words, no deathbed revelations. He simply closed his eyes and stopped breathing. It was the kind of quiet exit he had always preferred. The shogunate honored him with an elaborate funeral. Senior officials attended, including Shogun Iemitsu himself. Tributes praised his loyalty, his skill, his decades of service to the Tokugawa family. But the public ceremonies told only part of the story. The real measure of his legacy was what happened next. The Yagyu school continued to thrive. Mitsuyoshi took over as the shogun's official sword instructor, maintaining the family's position in the inner court. The intelligence networks Munenori had built kept operating, now run by his former students. The methods he had developed for managing threats and controlling information became standard practice for the shogunate. His influence was everywhere, even though he was gone. Heiho Kadensho became required reading for senior officials. The book's lessons about strategy, perception, and political survival proved just as relevant to later generations as they had been in Munenori's time. Samurai studied the text not just to improve their swordsmanship, but to understand how power actually worked. The life-giving sword philosophy spread beyond the Yagyu school, becoming part of how the Tokugawa government approached problems. The shogunate itself lasted another 200 years, finally ending in 1868. Throughout that entire period, the systems Munenori helped create remained in place. The emphasis on intelligence over force, the careful management of potential threats, the use of psychological pressure instead of violence. These were all part of his legacy. The Tokugawa peace was built on the foundation he had helped lay at Sekigahara and refined over decades of quiet, patient work. In Japanese culture, Munenori became a legendary figure, though the legend was complicated. Some stories celebrated him as the sword saint, the ultimate master of martial arts. Others portrayed him as a shadowy manipulator, the shogun's spy master who controlled Japan from behind the scenes. Both versions were partly true. He had been a genuine master swordsman and a ruthless political operator. The two sides of his life were inseparable. The deeper legacy was philosophical. Munenori had proven that the highest form of martial skill was not fighting at all. True mastery meant controlling situations so completely that violence became unnecessary. This idea resonated far beyond the world of swordsmanship. It influenced how Japanese leaders thought about power, conflict, and strategy for centuries. The life-giving sword became a metaphor for intelligent governance itself. Yagyu Munenori's story shows how one man mastered the shift from war to peace. He understood that Japan needed a new kind of warrior, someone who could win without fighting. The life-giving sword became more than a combat technique. It became a way of thinking about power itself. His shadow stretched across an entire era, shaping how the Tokugawa family ruled for 2 centuries. In the end, the greatest swordsman was the one who rarely drew his blade. That was the final lesson of the Sword Saint.